And for those of you who have just joined, we'll give it just one more minute, then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, we can go ahead and get moving. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to workshop number 9. This morning, we're going to talk about transmission and compliance. If we could go to the next slide, please. We might be having a little, there we go. Thank you. So before we jump in, let's just take a quick look at the agenda for this morning. For our first topic for transmission, we're going to review some of the stakeholder comment themes that we received from the written comments during the spring workshops. Then we're going to focus the bulk of our time exploring some of the unique regional issues that different parties face across the West to try to paint a holistic picture for everyone to sort of align and have a similar foundation as we continue to talk about what the design for the transmission requirement should look like. After we wrap up talking about transmission, we're going to move to compliance. Similar thing, we wanted to review the stakeholder comment themes that we received around some of the compliance design elements that were put out earlier in the spring. And then we're going to talk through some different conceptual approaches that we might take as we structure the compliance elements. So before I hand it off to John Mayhew from PNM, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. If you would, if you have a question or comment, just raise your hand. And don't forget to please state your name and which entity you represent. I will unmute you as quickly and hopefully as smoothly as possible. And the presenters will pause for questions at the end of each section. But if you have a question or comment, um, don't hesitate to just raise your hand as the presenters are speaking. And we'd really like for as much as possible this to be a dialogue. So with that, John Mayhew, I will hand it over to you and we can go to the next slide and begin the transmission portion.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, my name is John Mayhew. I'm a project manager for the regional markets here at P&M, and I'm going to kind of level set and talk about some of the stakeholder feedback we had received centering around transmission. So one of the key topics we discussed with stakeholders was how transmission should factor into a proposed approach. Overall, there was a broad agreement on important principles for resource adequacy, capacity to provide reliability value. That capacity must be able to reach customers when it is needed. In other words, deliverability matters. At the same time, stakeholders raised concerns about applying a broad one-size-fits-all requirement for firm transmission. Many noted that firm transmission rights can be difficult to secure, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, and making a rigid requirement challenging from a practical standpoint. Stakeholders also cautioned that overly prescriptive rules could increase costs, limit participation by resources, and reduce market liquidity. In addition, several participants noted that EDAM already includes transmission sufficiency mechanisms, leading some to question whether additional requirements would duplicate existing market processes. So the key takeaway is that stakeholders generally support the goal of ensuring deliverability while encouraging a balanced approach that maintains reliability without creating unnecessary barriers or costs. Next slide, please. So building on that feedback we discussed, many stakeholders expressed support for a more flexible approach to deliverability. Rather than applying a single transmission requirement across all resources, stakeholders generally favored solutions that account for actual system conditions and transmission constraints. Several alternatives were suggested, including requiring firm transmission only when resources must cross known constraint paths, creating deliverability zones where additional transmission requirements may not be as necessary, and conducting kind of a regional deliverability study, or combining targeted transmission requirements with EDAM's existing market optimization tools. So the common theme across all these proposals really is flexibility. Stakeholders emphasize that not all locations face the same transmission challenges, and they encourage an approach that focuses requirements where they may not be needed. Supporters of this framework noted that EDAM already incorporates mechanisms to address deliverability through market optimization, and they argued that a constraint-based approach may better reflect real-world operating systems while avoiding the need to secure firm transmission rights in areas where they provide little additional reliability benefit. And the key takeaway here is that stakeholders generally support ensuring that deliverability, but many believe that a targeted system-aware approach could achieve that objective more efficiently than a broad uniform transmission requirement. Next slide, please. Stakeholder feedback also highlighted that there may be a path forward that balances reliability objectives with practical implementation considerations. Several stakeholders indicated that they support firm transmission requirements if they were accompanied by a clear and narrowly tailored waiver process for situations where obtaining firm transmission is not commercially feasible. At the same time, stakeholders emphasized that any waiver framework would need to preserve the reliability goals of the program. Others expressed concern that transmission requirements that are too restrictive could have unintended consequences. Specifically, they noted overly stringent rules could reduce participation, increase costs for market participants, and potentially undermine the voluntary nature of the program. So taken together, the feedback reflects a shared objective of maintaining reliability while ensuring the framework remains practical, cost-effective, and accessible to all participants. So looking ahead, the work group is actively reviewing the feedback received and considering potential adjustments to the proposal. Our goal is to develop an updated approach that reflects stakeholder input and can be shared further in further discussions at our August 20th workshop. So the key takeaway from today's discussion is that stakeholders broadly agree on the importance of deliverability and reliability, but there are different perspectives on the best way to achieve those outcomes. And the next phase of this work will focus on finding the right balance between reliability, market participation, and operational feasibility. So with that overview of stakeholder feedback, the RA sponsors and the work group would like to discuss some of the regional challenges entities in the West face when it comes to transmission. First up will be a presentation on complications faced by entities in the Pacific Northwest. Then we'll hear the endeavors experienced by our friends at NV Energy. And lastly, I'll be joining you again later this morning to discuss some of the complications faced by PNM.
Thank you very much, John. Before we hand it over to Spencer, are there any questions? All right, I'm not seeing any hands go up. I think we can move to the next slide. And Spencer, will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And John, thanks for going over the stakeholder comments here first. I'm Spencer Graham, the executive director of NIPSI. NIPSI is the trade association for independent power producers and marketers, both wholesale and retail marketers in the Northwest. That's Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. The material I'm going to cover here today is focused on delivery practices in the Northwest for the retail marketer group of non-utility market participants in the Northwest. Focus on Oregon, but I'll provide some background on transacting on the Bonneville system too. You can go to the next slide. This table here provides some just starting information for folks here about the load of retail choice around the West and nationally. The 4 states outside of California that have formal retail choice programs, they're often called direct access, are listed here. They add up to about 10 terawatt hours of annual load. This is the most recently available data from EIA's surveys of utilities and marketers available each year. And then California is listed there at 26 terawatt hours a year. The total amount of direct access or retail choice service for energy only sales in the US is just under 500 terawatt hours. This data is energy only sales by retail power marketers. That's the term collected on EIA's surveys. It doesn't include bundled sales in restructured states like Texas that have a lot of bundled sales by a non-utility. So this is kind of the scope of the 5 of the 11 states in the West, what's usually considered the West, that have direct access programs. I'm going to dive into more detail on the Oregon component of this, but I thought it would be helpful to level set about the amount of energy sales in the West and thus load that is affected by programs like what we're talking about designing here with levels of transmission requirements depending how stringent they are and available to participants in the market. That just the last couple figures there, especially the US number, just for a point of comparison, that's more than half of the total annual load in the Western interconnection, which is about 900 terawatt hours a year. So one of the points I hope to convey in this slide is retail service, and in the West, this is mostly for commercial and industrial customers, is very common around the US outside of energy service by a utility. And in most of these jurisdictions, there is some kind of resource adequacy requirement that providers are complying with today and have had to comply with for years. So the West is sort of joining that band of states nationally that have resource adequacy requirements that affect retail choice and retail power marketers. You can go to the next slide. In Oregon specifically, I'm going to focus on the state here, not just because it's in NIPSI's area that we do our work in, but also because Oregon, of those 11 states, joins California as the 2 states that have a mandatory resource adequacy requirement imposed on load serving entities. Of course, in California's case, the CPUC oversees a program that applies to both jurisdictional utilities and retail service providers. In Oregon, it's a similar story, except there's no consumer choice, or CCAs rather. We have IOUs and load serving entities that are electricity service suppliers that the Oregon state requirements apply to. So in Oregon, as the last slide showed, it's about 3 terawatt hours of load each year. That's an average of a little over 300 megawatts. The program was authorized in state law in 1999 in the main law cited there, SB 1149, that restructured the Oregon market. We've had more than a quarter century since the rules were promulgated after 1999 to set up the direct access program in Oregon. It applies under the regulations set by the Oregon PUC to commercial and industrial loads over a megawatt in metered load size. It's usually referred to in Oregon as direct access. The program has programmatic caps. These are based on a weather normalized load of each of the two principal investor-owned utilities, respectively. There are separate regulatory caps for existing load that chooses to exit utility service and caps for new load that first place. And then there are also waiver opportunities for new, for example, data centers that want to go to direct access, but whose entry into the direct access program would be above the regulatory caps. Like in most states with some level of retail choice, bundled customers leaving utility service to get a new energy supplier pay exit fees to make sure there's no cross subsidization. And then all direct access customers, both new and existing loads, pay non-bypassable charges to cover the number of costs that bundled customers of the utilities are on the hook for as well. In Oregon, there are annual selection windows. This is different than in some states where it was a one-time option or a periodic every couple decades option to leave utility service. And the typical contract tenors in the Oregon Direct Access Program are between 1 and 5 years. That means at the expiration of that contract, the loads can select to pick another competitive power supplier or to rejoin utility service. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the EIA term of art, the retail power marketers in Oregon, the statutory term is electricity service suppliers, or ESS. The 5 ESSs in Oregon that currently provide service are members of NIPSI. They compete with each other and with the utilities to supply energy to those direct access loads. These loads are typically large sawmills, semiconductor facilities, increasingly data centers, well-recognized companies in Oregon and nationally. These are some of the same companies that provide direct access to some loads in California. There, the acronym is ESP instead of ESS. Under direct access in Oregon, there's typically contractual enforcement of deliverability. If an ESS fails to deliver to the direct access load, the contract between the load and the supplier usually has a form of financial damages bilaterally between the two parties. This is often in the form of a liquidated damages clause. This is one of the primary mechanisms that has incentivized, appropriately so, the reliable delivery of energy bought under direct access. The risk of not delivering is borne by the ESS, by the retail power marketer, and they face financial penalties from their customer commensurate with the consequence of not having electricity when they were supposed to. In Oregon, at least, and this is different than in other states with direct access, ESSs are NITS customers of the host balancing authority, which is also the transmission owner, either PGE or Pacific Corp. And as such, in some states, it's actually the load that is the NITS customer rather than the retail power marketer. As such, in Oregon, the marketers manage their own book of transmission, a portfolio of transmission rights, some combination of long-term rights and short-term, both firm and non-firm. And given the nature of Bonneville and the Northwest grid, it ends up being a quite Bonneville-centric transmission portfolio. Until May of 2024, there was not a granular mandatory RA rule in Oregon for either IOUs or ESSs. The Oregon Commission adopted a regulation imposing an RA requirement on both types of load serving entities. I've given the citation there. And this rulemaking was in light of the creation of the Western Resource Adequacy Program and was really designed around the LSEs, the load serving entities in the state participating in a regional program. And the kind of value proposition there was to reduce the overall compliance cost by pooling program requirements, by pooling the diversity of generation and load across a large area to reduce the planning reserve margin. The situation in Oregon is we have this requirement on the books, but the LSEs have now exited the binding program of RAP. And so we're in the position of seeking some kind of replacement regional program. Go to the next slide, please. I mentioned Bonneville. I'm going to just provide a quick and dirty summary of the importance of Bonneville and how it plays a role in securing transmission service that affects direct access in the Northwest. This map shows Bonneville's principal lines. The backbone system is really the 345 to 500 kV system that Bonneville has in red there. You can see the DC, the Pacific tie there in blue at a higher voltage going down to Los Angeles. Bonneville is more than just a large transmission owner in the Northwest, and my next slide will explain this. But as you can see where different utilities are situated in this map, Avista centered in Spokane, Portland General, of course, in Portland, the couple of utilities centered around Seattle. It's virtually impossible to transact as a major utility or a retail power marketer within the Northwest without in some way crossing Bonneville's service territory. And therefore, wheeling across Bonneville is a huge part of doing business in the Northwest in a way that's relatively unique in the West. You can go to the next slide, please. Bonneville owns about 15,000 circuit miles of high voltage transmission. That is 3/4 of the system within the core Northwest footprint shown on the previous map. Neighboring transmission providers own a lot of transmission too, depending on the voltage cutoff. PacifiCorp has a comparable size system, but of course it covers more of the Northern Rockies and Intermountain states. But within the Northwest proper, within the Columbia Basin, again, that size of that dominant position in transmission is just a fact of life. Bonneville's system is different than many transmission owners in the West. It is not primarily driven by native load. Bonneville was given a directive by Congress to build transmission to deliver power across a diversified area from federal hydro facilities. Bonneville markets power from the federal dams, but doesn't actually own them, but it does own the transmission. And the development of that system from large dams to load around the Northwest has generated a system that's not primarily driven by what most transmission planners and transmission owners are dealing with, which is more of a native load situation. Bonneville has more of a connective network. It's really the glue in the Northwest that binds the region together across many different balancing authorities. The Bonneville system, of course, is owned by the federal government. It's subject to open access requirements, but for the most part is not FERC jurisdictional. Therefore, there are many exceptions to some of the norms and standards that FERC applies to jurisdictional transmission service providers. Bonneville does attempt, for the most part, to comply or follow some of the same directives, but there are variations on the Bonneville system that transmission customers have to be aware of and have to be aware of the differences in terms of enforcement on Bonneville. A very high percentage of Bonneville's revenue requirement is for point-to-point sales, both long-term and short-term. There's a higher degree of scheduling flexibility on Bonneville's system. It's very common to have transmission customers with TSRs to request redirects, and historically, at least for Bonneville, to accept the request for redirects where there's a different point of delivery that the customer proposes rather than what their transmission service rights would indicate. That's a highly unusual volume of flexibility on Bonneville system in terms of scheduling that's made it, I don't want to say RTO, sort of quasi RTO-like, but it has a degree of flexibility for third-party customers that's quite unusual for a system that's not on a flow-based RTO or ISO style paradigm. The transmission revenue requirement is about $1.5 billion right now. And here's kind of the key fact in terms of a comparison to other transmission providers. Only about 17% of that revenue requirement to cover the system costs is from NITS customers. The sale of the NITS transmission product, more than half of that revenue requirement is covered by point-to-point sales. And that really just numerically illustrates the point I was making on the fifth bullet there. Like many transmission providers, Bonneville has had fairly overwhelmed queues. The interconnection queue challenges are, I think, part and parcel of challenges other transmission owners and service providers have faced nationally. Bonneville similarly had an overwhelmed queue for new commercially driven transmission service requests. There is almost no spare long-term firm ATC, available transfer capability, on the key paths, at least on Bonneville's system. And in some ways, that couldn't happen at a worse time in terms of setting up resource adequacy programs with an expectation for the acquisition of firm or conditional firm service from an oversubscribed system. Finally, I think a key fact about Bonneville is the agency has really struggled to pivot and respond quickly enough to the timelines, both for resource adequacy and for some of the direct access requirements. I'd put my finger on that 1 to 5 year contract tenor as an example of a norm in direct access nationally for customers being able to pick their supplier, really not meshing with the timeline to develop new federal transmission or to upgrade lines. And that's been a challenge for us in thinking about this program. I've got one more slide, sir. So a few points I wanted to leave you with, and then I've got a couple of colleagues who are with individual electricity service suppliers to dig into more of this in the Northwest. First of all, the vast majority of US retail choice load is in a jurisdiction that has restructured its transmission practices. In most of those jurisdictions, resource adequacy is a requirement, but part of that requirement is not the demonstration of holding a long-term firm portfolio, either for NITS or point-to-point service, because the underlying transmission paradigm has changed. And so the West, as a still largely bilateral world, notwithstanding the creation of EDAM, we are in the unusual position in terms of formulating a resource adequacy program on a regional basis of both retaining the contract path framework and having states that promote direct access. And when I say promote, in Oregon statute, among the many directives that the legislature has given the Oregon PUC, is to make sure there's a healthy retail competitive direct access program. And so balancing those two objectives in the West of a number of states that do have direct access and a contract path framework that affects deliverability is a challenge. I mentioned earlier the contrast between the contract tenor for most direct access contracts. Retail choice really has meaning if customers have the ability to switch their supplier on a regular basis. And if the length of that tenor is more determined by transmission expansion timelines, which tend to run 10 to 20 years, it sort of begs the question, what retail choice is left in that kind of situation? We've been struggling to come up with a good and feasible solution to address that tricky question. The work group has also been wrestling with what the appropriate role of transmission planners is versus balancing authorities versus load serving entities within a balancing authority if there are multiple, versus load itself in making long-term investment commitments to expand transmission capacity. Finally, you'll hear from Greg McDonald from Shell a little bit more about how the priority service designation for transmission compares to actual deliverability data for the Northwest on Bonneville's system. And I would be remiss not to finish with the point that while 5 states in the West have authorized direct access, 6 have not, at least not outside of some kind of green tariff or utility pass-through program. And so we've also wrestled with how to make sure that whatever we come up with as a proposal from our respective sectors to all of you as stakeholders for a transmission component of RA, how can that make sure it respects different state choices, both for states that have enabled direct access or retail choice and states that have not? And we want to make sure that we come up with something that that does both. Sarah, that's what I had to present, and happy to pause for questions or turn it over to Greg McDonald or to Bill Goddard.
Thank you, Spencer. I don't see any hands going up at the moment. So, Bill, I think we can turn it over to you, and then Greg will follow up after you.
So Greg, would you like to go first and then I'll wrap up, or I can go now and then segue to you?
Yeah, Bill, if you want to go ahead, that works.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I'm Bill Goddard. I'm representing Calpine Energy Solutions. We are a PSS and we have load in Oregon. We also have load in virtually all of the RTOs from ERCOT to my. So this slide doesn't apply to me. I don't have a slide. To PJM, to New England ISO, to New York ISO. But what I wanted to talk about briefly today, it is almost exactly the 50-year anniversary of when I got into this business. So in the 1976, I started at San Diego Gas and Electric. What I'm going to talk about is I was there in a lot of the real key restructuring changes that were made, and I wanted to highlight how transmission was so instrumental and so important and such a challenge to overcome. So that's how this is all going to fit together, I hope. I'm only going to take a few minutes. So it started at San Diego Gas and Electric. Very shortly, I was running the day-ahead desk, not running the day-ahead desk, but co-running it. It was an interesting situation. They had a couple old codgers who did the day-ahead scheduling that were really difficult to work with. And at the time, I was a new engineering assistant, and none of the old guys there wanted to work with him. So they said, let's try that guy. So I ended up working with these old guys, and I won them over and really learned a lot from them. But anyway, so at that point, we are forecasting the SDGE load. SDG was what was called a control area back then. They're called balancing authorities now. Everybody was pretty much a utility back then. This was before the energy restructuring. So you would forecast your load, run a unit commitment program for your generation. In our case, we had to run an AC power flow analysis as well because we had a very underbuilt transmission system. We needed to make sure it would hold together. A lot of times we would have minimum generation requirements or have to put on other additional units to make the whole system work. And we were in what was called back then the California Power Pool with Southern California Edison and PG&E. There was a reserve sharing pool. There was limited transmission for us back then. It was pretty much buying down the Pacific Intertie AC and DC lines through, it was called the ICP back then, Interconnected Pool. And it was a vertically integrated utility like we were back then. A key change happened in the mid-'80s called the WSPP was created. San Diego Gas Electric was one of the original signers of that. And I remember the day that they came in and said, we have a contract. Let me back up a little bit. Before that, it was a time-consuming, long process to contract with utility to utility to get a power deal together. The WSPP was basically a group deal. It set out all the different contracts and really opened up the whole wholesale power market. The first deal we got to schedule was from Louis Dreyfus. So that to me back then was, I don't know how to schedule this. And this begat the whole concept of what became known as e-tagging, because back you had to the balancing areas, the control areas had to know exactly what transmission, where it was being delivered. So each of these transactions would have a marketing string who was actually the power marketers, but it also had to have the source generator to the sync load to any transmission that was bought. And it was a pretty complicated process. It had to get automated over time. It was a real challenge to begin with. So that really opened up the wholesale market. Then in the mid 90s, FERC had two tariffs passed, Order 888 and Order 889. And the idea here was we wanted to restructure the electricity markets to open it up for more competition. How are we going to do that? Well, one of the real key impediments to that was the transmission system. I kind of looked at this as if you had a bunch of trucking companies, but one of those trucking companies owned the freeway, that would not be a level playing field. So that for 888 standards of conduct tried to eliminate any advantage that a market affiliate might have with their transmission partner. So they could not freely communicate. When we implemented that at SDGE, it was even because we were in the same building at the time, we were able to put us on different floors. Very detailed, making sure the marketing group and the grid group didn't talk to each other. FERC 889 was the open access tariff and OASIS. So this is open access same time information system. So the idea was here to be to really have a market treating transmission fairly. They wanted to have a system where it was provided to everybody at the same time. You couldn't call your buddy and say, hey, this line came in early, or we've expanded this. No, it all came at the same time. So that was in the 90s. That directly affected me because at that point I went over from the grid side to the marketing side. And we were buying and selling power. We had our generation. And at that point, you had to buy transmission from the person that you used to just yell across the control room about. So there became a wall there that was available to everybody else. On the heels of that, the Cal ISO and California Power Exchange were proposed and implemented. So I spent several years of my career implementing the Cal ISO and the Cal PX. It was it was a heartbreaker for me because what it did was it took the former balancing areas, control areas of San Diego Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and Pacific Gas and Electric, and that became under the jurisdiction of the California Independent System Operator, and SCGE was no longer a control area. The markets implemented, maybe appropriately on April Fool's Day in 1998, and at that point I'm on the marketing side and I'm bidding SDGE's generation. I'm forecasting the load and bidding the generation. They opened up the reserve markets. So the generators I had at my disposal had a lot of regulations, spinning reserve and that sort of thing. So we're able to really make a lot of money on the reserve markets. It valued our generation a lot and part of this whole restructuring required SDGE to divest their generation. So when SDGE divested their generation, there wasn't a whole lot for me to do there anymore. So at that point, I was asked to help start up an ESS, which I didn't know what it was at the time, but energy service provider, ESP, I guess they were. And I was asked, can you start up an electricity, basically the contracting and the compliance and an electric operations group, which we did. And that one, Semper Energy Solutions, went through a bunch of ownerships and eventually became Calpine Energy Solutions, which is where I am now. So that's as you can see in each case, transmission was real key. You can't have really a market that's a level playing field without transmission. And I appreciate how this group, it's right on the edge there of electricity is market commodity. You can buy it in the market, but it's also an essential need. So I think that's why we're working so hard to get this right in an RA construct, because reliability with a also market, that's a difficult balance to maintain. And I appreciate how this group is really trying to focus and make both halves of that work. So That's what I wanted to talk about, give you a little historical perspective on that. And if no questions, I'll segue over to Greg from Shell. Um, so any questions? Otherwise, turn it over to Greg to talk about his topic.
Thank you, Bill. And if we could get the slides back up on the screen. Wonderful. All right. Greg McDonald from Shell, please take it away.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, just fine.
All right, fantastic. Well, yeah, no, thanks for the introduction. My name is Greg McDonald. I'm with Shell Energy. We are an electric service supplier, an ESS. We have load in Portland, General Electric's service territory, and so we are one of the Oregon load serving entities. So today, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of several of the transmission related challenges that are really facing entities in the Pacific Northwest. Along with a look at some of the key transmission data that's particularly relevant to the discussions of deliverability requirements under this program design. So given really our position here is an Oregon LSE and Bonneville's central role as the region's primary transmission provider, looking at BPA's system really served as sort of a logical and an informative starting point for this analysis to inform this discussion. So on this first slide here, I'll provide credit and thanks to Aurora Energy for allowing me to share some of the content that they've produced. But this is a look at BPA's forecasted out long-term available transfer capability from 2027 through 2036. And so what we can see at a very high level here is that several of the key paths are showing zero available capability through the 2036 timeframe. And this is something that Spencer had alluded to. And so this kind of just puts some numbers behind it. You can see the TTC column here in the left, and then you can see along various of these high capacity corridors really being heavily subscribed with limited ability really at Bonneville's level to expand this capacity over the time frame through 2036. So BPA system on the ATC supply side of the equation here is really quite tight. Next slide, please. So this is really a look at the demand side of the equation, and this is the pending long-term firm transmission service requests in the queue that are broken out by path. So the horizontal bars here in the third column represent the total megawatts of queue demand, with the second column showing the total transfer capability. And it's rank ordered by the volume of demand on these pathways from highest to lowest. And what you can really see at a high level here is that some of the key transfer pathways have a lot of demand behind them. And in many cases, there are TSR volumes that are well in excess of the posted TTC, which we saw from the last slide is really mostly subscribed. And so just really looking at a few of these pathways, like Cross Cascades North, for example, from east to west, you can see, TTC of about 8,700 megawatts with about almost 12,000 megawatts of demand sitting behind it. And for Cross Cascades South, for example, you can see about, excuse me here for a moment. Just lost. There we go. For Cross Cascades South from east to west, you can see about 5,500 megawatts of TTC with about over 10,000 megawatts of demand behind it. And that trend sort of tracks down through the rest of these transmission pathways. And so really the high level takeaway here is that as a result of the sheer scale and volume of demand on these paths compared to the TTC, back in February of 2025, Bonneville had to pause their transmission service request study and evaluation process, also known as TSEP. And they were working through the grid access transformation, the GAP process, which is now turned into the TC27, which is currently in settlements discussions. Next slide, please. In March of 2025, Elaine Hart with Sylvan Energy Analytics and in partnership with GridLab published a report titled Toward a More Holistic and Adaptive Treatment of BPA Transmission Rights in Northwest Utility Planning and Procurement Processes. And this is really, in my opinion, a great piece of work, and just express some gratitude and thanks here to Elaine for allowing me to use some of this content in this presentation. So I've provided a link to this report for anybody that might be interested in reading it. This will be on the slide deck that is posted to the ROW website. I've pulled a few pieces of key information from this report that are really pertinent to the conversations that we're having on the transmission requirements. This is all this all comes from a data set that Bonneville publishes. They publish their curtailment data, and Elaine has pulled this from the 2008 through 2024. And what she found is that over this time frame, transmission curtailments occurred in 0.17% of hours and averaged about 401 megawatt hours across the entire BPA system during those intervals. The curtailment statistics on high regional demand days were essentially identical. And when considering the specific hours of the highest demand, curtailments were actually less frequent and smaller at 0.14% of intervals and 219 megawatt hours on average. So this data suggests that the transmission curtailments are both rare and small under typical operating conditions and no more likely or severe during regional peak load conditions. Most of the internal paths here saw congestion fewer than 10 hours per year. Many of them saw congestion less than 1 hour per year. And across all of the curtailment events between 2008 and 2024, just under 22% of the curtailed energy was on Priority 7 transmission rights. On days with high regional demand during capacity critical hours, about 90% of the curtailed energy was on firm transmission. So it's an interesting piece of work, and it really implies that securing firm transmission service doesn't guarantee that a resource will be unaffected by curtailments when they do occur. Next slide, please. So I wanted to sort of jump in here and pick up to some extent where Elaine left off. I pulled data from the same data set, just over a different time frame. So looking at curtailment from 2023 to 2025. And actually, I think the first point I'll make on this slide here pertains to the product usage. So Bonneville has been publishing its product usage, and it's a discontinued data set. And the last time they published this was for the period Q4 2022 through Q4 2023. So this is the last two bullets here. And what this shows is the reservation request type, the product usage. So we're really looking at what volume we have for originals, renewals, redirects, resales, consolidations, and so forth. I have very loosely referred to this as tagged volume. And so what we're seeing here is about, over the course of this 1 year period, about 355 million megawatts of reservations on Bonneville's system. Almost 30% of this was tagged on non-firm transmission, and about 71% of this was tagged on firm transmission. And providing that as a bit of a backdrop, I think, here for the rest of the data that we're going to take a closer look at. So for this data set, we looked at 3 years from 2023 through 2025. And I've got, just to start off, a couple of sort of very simple like temporal distribution plots here that show when these curtailments occurred on the grid. And so you can see in the bottom left here, the majority of the curtailments took place during October, which is traditionally a shoulder month, which is then followed by curtailment volumes in January. Uh, the chart on the right here shows a breakdown of the volumes that were non-firm versus firm. So you've got the non-firm in the light blue on the top of the bar chart and the firm curtailments in the dark blue on the bottom of the chart. And just for clarity's sake, firm transmission in this context is anything that's NERC priority 6 or 7. Non-firm is anything NERC priority 5 and below. Next slide, please. So this chart is a summary of firm and non-firm curtailments versus the total volume split up by pathway. And it's rank ordered from left to right by pathways that see the highest level of curtailment. So really what we're seeing here is if we take, for example, the bar on the far left, this is the Northwest AC intertie from south to north. This is the most curtailed path on Bonneville's system. And you can see the firm volumes that are curtailed on this path in blue and the non-firm volumes that are curtailed on this path in orange. So you've got about 90% of all the curtailments that take place on the Northwest AC intertie from south to north being on non-firm transmission. It's very much so the same story for LeGrand east to west, where you see close to 100% of curtailed volume being on non-firm transmission products. But then the story changes when you look at west of Garrison east to west and Northwest AC intertie from north to south, where you're actually seeing over 50% or maybe more of a 50-50 split here between firm and non-firm. It sort of inverts again here with LeGrand west to east and the Pacific DC intertie south to north, where you're seeing significantly more curtailments on non-firm that switches back here for a few of these other pathways that are lesser curtailed, but you're seeing higher overall volumes of firm transmission curtailed versus non-firm. I think again here the important caveat is looking at this from the backdrop of understanding that 70% or so of the total transmission that we will say is tagged is on firm transmission and 30% is non-firm. But I think this provides a bit of an interesting look at some of the data. And it shows that really there are different curtailment rates between different pathways and also between different products. And as to the prior slide, at different time frames as well. Next slide, please. So we took a closer look at some of this curtailment data as it pertains to deliveries to the Portland General Electric's balancing area and also to Pacific Corp West, given our position as an Oregon load serving entity. And so these two pivot charts here, we have Portland deliveries on the left and Pacific Corp West deliveries on the right. And this is looking at a POR, POD. This is looking at deliveries with a POD of bpat.pge and just taking an annual average over this 3-year period. And what we found is that from 2023 through 2025, there was an average yearly total of about 497 megawatt hours of tag curtailments across both firm and non-firm. And you can see the split here with about 150 being on firm and 350 or so being on non-firm for Portland. For PAC, we are seeing smaller volumes at about 193 megawatt hours of tag curtailments on average for each year, with about a 50-50 split between firm and non-firm transmission across these pathways that have a point of delivery at bpat.pacwest or bpat.pge. Next slide, please. So this last slide is just sort of a unique way, I suppose, of looking at a more granular look at the data here. So this is all of the POR and POD pathways that were available, at least within this 3-year data set. So there's about 250 pathways. And I think what you can see, like at a very high level, is that there's a mix of curtailments across these paths. And so what this shows is the total curtailments of each of these paths, sort of indicated here by the color and the weight of these connections. And so you can see, John Day to Malin, this pathway is the most curtailed. LeGrand to BPAT Avangrid and Townsend to Garrison, also heavily curtailed, and then sort of followed by some of these deliveries to John Day from BPAT Northwest and from LeGrand to Northwest Hub and so forth. Of course, you'll quickly realize these are in no specific geographic order or outlay. This is more just for directional and indicative purposes. But really, the high-level takeaway here is that some paths are constrained and some paths really are not. And so if you look at sort of the webbing that serves as a backdrop to this nodal schematic, you'll see numerous pathways that have either zero or very close to zero curtailment volumes over this time frame. So really, the conclusion here, at least that I've landed on, is that for Bonneville's system, there's a very strong dichotomy between contractual and physical congestion. And curtailment across these different paths and products is very much so a mixed bag. And so this is something that we've been inspecting and using to inform some of the discussions that we're having in the transmission subgroup as we explore deliverability as part of this program design. Thank you. Happy to take any questions or pass it on to the next presenter.
Any questions before we move further east? Well, Greg, I'm not seeing any hands shoot up, so appreciate you walking us through that. And I think we can go to the next slide and transition over to David Rubin from NVE, who's going to talk to us about some of the unique issues that Nevada contends with from a transmission perspective.
Thanks, Sarah. Although I don't know how unique they will be, because I'm going to try and stay pretty close to the FERC pro forma oath.
Sounds good.
I could have the next slide. And this I put in there, obviously one for amusement, but two just to emphasize that Nevada is really this combination of the old and the new. Although I do want to thank Bill Goddard for making me feel a little less old, as I've only been doing this for 41 years. Could I have the next slide? So historically, NV Energy has operated as two systems, the Sierra Pacific Power in the north and Nevada Power in the south. And transfers between the two systems needed to go through either California or Utah. It wasn't until January of 2014 that Online provided a 500 kV link between the two systems. As illustrated in the right side of the slide, we are currently constructing two additional 500 kV lines. Greenlink West provides a parallel north to south path to Online, and then Greenlink North ties the two lines together, enhancing the reliability of the state. Greenlink West is currently scheduled to go into service at the end of 2027 and Greenlink North at the end of 2028. Together, the Greenlink lines will increase the import capacity into northern Nevada from the 1,275 megawatts currently to 2,800 megawatts. And can I have the next slide? So this was just to state the obvious that our transmission process is based on FERC's requirements as incorporated by the Commission's pro forma open access tariff. And I would note that for NV Energy, there's no distinction in the application of that tariff between our retail choice, the 704B customers, our municipal customers, or even our merchant on behalf of native load. The next slide, please. So with respect to network integration transmission service, or NITS, the critical component is the use of designated network resources, or DNRs, to serve the network load. And in order to qualify as a DNR, the customer must show that either one, the customer owns the resource, two, the customer is committed to purchase the generation pursuant to an executed contract, or three, the customer is committed to purchase the generation where execution of the contract is contingent upon the availability of transmission service. And with respect to that last criteria, for NV Energy, it means that there has to be agreement as to all material terms to the contract, like quantity, price, and duration, so that the only contingency left is that availability of firm transmission. Now, importantly, DNRs must be dedicated to serve the network load on a non-interruptible basis, as these are the critical resources that our transmission control room relies upon to ensure reliable balancing authority area operations. And the next slide, please. I put this in here just to illustrate that, as noted on the slide, DNRs can be off system, and that the customer must provide the delivery point on our border as well as the external transmission arrangements. It is the establishment of these off-system DNRs that enables the transmission customer to reserve the import capacity in our system. And as noted on the next slide, slide 26, please, that FERC clarified in paragraph 867 of order number 890A that the customer must show that they have firm transmission from the point at which they take title to the energy to the transmission provider's border. And FERC found that there was no need for the transmission provider to verify the firmness of the upstream legs, as the contracts were to be firm in nature. And this is illustrated on the next slide. Could I have slide 27? So just the reminder that when order number 890 came out, FERC found that the WSPP Schedule C arrangement then in effect would not qualify to be a DNR because it provided for liquidated damages for non-delivery. So in response, the WSPP modified the agreement to prohibit interruptions for reasons other than the reliability of service to native load. And FERC found that this level of firmness was adequate for the WSPP Schedule C contracts to qualify for DNRs. And then the final slide, please. And then this slide just attempts to connect the dots between the firmness required for the DNR to the firmness required for a WSPP Schedule C agreement to the firmness required to count for an EDAM resource efficiency evaluation. And with that, I will pause for any questions before turning things back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, David. I'll just give it another second or two. All right. We will continue moving even slightly further east. And John, I'll turn it over to you to talk with us a little bit about how PNM is situated.
Thank you, Sarah. So hello again. Today I kind of wanted to talk about the challenges that PNM faces managing the complexities of the transmission grid across New Mexico. At PNM, our job is simply to move power across hundreds of miles of the desert landscape to reach our customers' homes and businesses. And right now that grid is under real pressure. So over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through the three big challenges that PNM faces. Parts of the grid are already full. A lot of that is being used by companies other than PNM. And our system is tightly linked to our neighbors. So my goal is to leave you with a clear picture of the pressure P&M experiences with the grid, and I promise you that an engineering degree will not be required. So next slide, please. So I'd like to start with the big picture. Imagining the grid as a highway system. P&M's highways stretch hundreds of miles, and the trouble comes in three parts. First, many of our key routes are full. Every lane is already spoken for. Second, a big share of the space on those lines is reserved by companies other than P&M because federal rules require that we share those. And third, our grid doesn't stand alone. It really relies on our neighbors. It plugs directly into our neighbors. And so what happens on their grid affects our grid. And these three pressures combined together is what I would like to dig into today. Next slide, please. So the first pressure that P&M face is really the simplest. The lines are full. Many of our main corridors are already carrying as much power as they can safely handle. Imagine, if you will, a freeway at rush hour. There's just simply no more room to squeeze any more cars in. And that creates really two problems. When the power needs to travel from where it is generated to where people actually live, it gets stuck in those bottlenecks. And then secondarily, in southern New Mexico, it's even trickier because in order to reach that, we have to send power over lines P&M doesn't even own. So when new businesses want to connect or demand simply grows, there's very little space for us to work with. Next slide, please. So the second pressure is about who uses the grid. By federal law, P&M has to offer space on our lines to other power companies. It keeps the market open and fair for everyone. But this also means a large share of our system is reserved for electricity that never serves our own customers here in New Mexico. When those reservations fill the line, there's little room left to serve new local demand. Currently, if you look at P&M's system, about 45% is owned by or is used by P&M. The other 55 is used by other companies. On the flip side, to reach southern New Mexico, our own customers actually depend on lines from other companies. So we're sharing our grid with outsiders as well as leaning on other outside grids to serve our customers. Next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of history and explain, it sort of explains how P&M got into the situation we're in today. So our transmission lines were built decades ago, and it was for one main purpose: to bring large amounts of power from big coal and nuclear from far away into our load centers, which are Albuquerque and Santa Fe. They do this job. Our system does this job really well. They connect us to systems all across the West, but they weren't designed for today's world of wind, solar, geothermal, and new energy storage resources. So our links to those cleaner resources are a bit more challenging. And here's how that space gets used up. As I mentioned, about 45% of our transmission grid is to serve our customers, roughly 2,100 megawatts. The other 55% is moving power from third-party generators in our state, and often that power is moving its way west into Arizona and all the way into California. So in short, it's a well-built older system, and now it's doing a job that it wasn't initially designed to do. Next slide, please. So the third pressure that we face is our neighbors. As I mentioned, P&M is not an island. We're wired directly into our neighboring utility systems. And in plain terms, there are legacy contracts and agreements across the desert Southwest where our grid meets theirs. And we connect with Arizona Public Service, WAPA, El Paso Electric, Tucson Electric, all at major connection points around our state. This is imperative for P&M's system. These connections are how we import and export excess power, especially when demand spikes. And that's a strength. We can lean on our neighbors in a pinch, but it also means we depend on them, and decisions they make can ripple into our system. Next slide, please. So now our neighbors aren't just in physical connections. They're also making business choices that affect us. Utilities across the West are joining regional markets. And as everyone knows, everyone is picking a different marketplace. So PNM is set to join EDAM in the fall of 2027, but several of our closest neighbors in Arizona and beyond are choosing a different path, Markets Plus. And there are a few that are undecided, and PNM is communicating with them about their options and what we're going to do, as I'm sure the other Desert Southwest entities are doing the same. So the utilities we're physically wired to are splitting into different clubs, let's say. And when your trading partners are in a different market than you, doing business across the lines gets a little bit more complicated. Next slide, please. Therefore, when PNM joins one market and our neighbors join another, we happen to be sitting right on that dividing line. And it brings up one of the West's new favorite buzzwords, a seam. So being on a seam creates new headaches. Trading power with our Arizona neighbors now has to cross that divide, which adds costs and makes scheduling a bit clunkier. We also have to satisfy different rules and making sure that we keep enough power on hand for peak times and during extreme weather events, a summer heat wave or a deep winter freeze. So a divided Desert Southwest means less ability to share power back and forth when we need it most. And then embedded within these seams are two competing resource adequacy programs, each with their own thoughts and ideas on transmission requirements. So we're adding a different set of requirements on an already tightly constrained shared system. And the timeline is tight as well. So all these changes are going to land sometime between 2026 and 2028. So it's imperative that PNM is planning now and not later. Next slide, please. So bringing this all together, PNM's grid faces three pressures that I've talked about that add up to real uncertainty. First, very little room to grow. All the key routes are accounted for and they're full. So serving rising demand is going to be more of a challenge. Second, we rely heavily on lines that other companies reserve and are out of our control. We only have a small percentage of that, and we have larger customers that are using up a majority of the capacity that's available. And then third, we're sitting on a market scene that's adding cost and complexity. So together, these three touch points are the things that really affect the things that PNM cares about the most. What our customers pay, how reliable the grid is, and PNM's ability to keep the lights on as demand grows. None of what I've talked about today is unsolvable. We're going to figure it out and we're going to get it done. But it illustrates why resource adequacy is imperative for PNM and why major components of a resource adequacy program, such as transmission requirements, are vital. That's really what I had presented for today. Thanks for the time. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, John. Before we transition to compliance, any questions or thoughts from anyone, just in general about what was presented from a transmission perspective? Bill Goddard, go right ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. Just a quick question. You have no room to grow, key quarters fully subscribed. I assume that means as far as the Oasis, they're fully subscribed on Oasis. Do you feel there's actually more room? Like, are they actually approaching overload or potential curtailments? You think there's room if they did a power flow analysis, or do you think you're really fully subscribed both in what people are reserving and what the actual system capability is?
Specifically fully subscribed. And there are lines being built, and some of that is going to provide some relief. Really, the concern for PNM is, a lot of the lines being built in New Mexico are not being built by PNM, but third party, and it's to move their generation. But yes, fully subscribed is probably a more accurate way of putting the situation.
Thanks, John.
Any other thoughts on transmission? Max Green, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I just not going to be long. Just wanted to particularly appreciate Greg's presentation on curtailment data across different BPA paths. I think that was really helpful in understanding the dynamics at play in our region and good context for trying to come up with a transmission solution for an EDMRA product. So just appreciation. That's all.
Thanks, Max. I'll pause just a moment longer. All right, I'm not seeing any hands, so I think we can move to the next slide, but thank you, transmission presenters, and just wanted to note that the intent for this workshop was really try to reflect the conversations that are taking place in the work group. So these perspectives are being voiced by the different entities within the work group. So we really wanted to just take a moment to try to paint a holistic picture about all of the different issues that we are grappling with and trying to thread a difficult needle to really come up with a construct that is going to meet the needs of many. But before we go on, Megan Decker, you should be unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi there, and thanks for this. I just realized before we moved on, and in response to what you just said about trying to illuminate the discussions and perspectives that are present in the work group, was what we heard today sort of all the perspectives, or are there significant, sort of missing pieces from the transmission operations lenses that we just kind of looked through?
I will let others chime in, but I will try a response myself. I think really the conversations that have been happening in the work group, a lot of them have centered kind of around the Pacific Northwest. But obviously other entities are facing transmission constraints and concerns that they will also need addressed as we're putting together the framework. I won't say this is 100% exhausted because we just heard from 3 different entities, but I think this is probably pretty reflective of sort of the main voices and the folks who have sort of maybe the biggest needle to thread. But I don't want to suggest that it is 100% exhausted, because we definitely have some other perspectives and voices that weren't present in these presentations too.
I might add, thanks for the question, Megan, that at least in a first pass at thinking through what a set of transmission requirements could be for the program, maybe it's been most evident or evident the earliest in the Northwest affected by Bonneville's system that that's a little bit where the crux of the problem is early on. And the decades-long reliance on non-firm transmission and redirects, and that being a norm in the Northwest that's, as far as I can tell, less prevalent in other subgrids, I guess, is what led us to want to help explain the situation better to our colleagues within the work group in other regions. And so we thought it'd be important to reflect that education we've done for other stakeholders. But to Sarah's point, this clearly isn't an exhaustive presentation of all the EDAM entities and corners of the footprint of EDAM.
Okay, thanks, guys. I guess just speaking for myself personally, obviously, I should have said I'm consulting for the Western Interstate Energy Board, but I personally have more familiarity with the Northwest and less familiarity with the Southwest and California, particularly when you're talking about the publicly owned utilities. So, kind of the status quo for other parts of the region that maybe issues, in the in the Northwest kind of fit into, would be, helpful to hear about at some point as you're, telling us about what solutions you come up with. So thanks.
Thanks, Megan. Any other thoughts or questions before we move to compliance? All right, let's go ahead and transition over to our compliance discussion. And Roger, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go over the high-level stakeholder feedback on compliance. So some areas of stakeholder alignment that we saw was monthly showings should be binding. Cost causation should govern penalties and backstop costs. And participants should have opportunities to cure deficiencies. And compliance should encourage forward procurement. We've also looked at maybe transmission and capacity shortfalls may need different treatment and structure. Next slide, please. Where we saw some stakeholder split was on the firmness of penalties. With less firm penalties could cause reliability issues and reduce procurement incentives, whereas overly punitive penalties could discourage participation and increase costs without improving reliability.
And Roger, I'll jump in to here. I probably should have said this at the outset. Similar to kind of the transmission conversation, really trying to reflect what the work group, the conversations that they're having, we're trying to do the same thing on the compliance side too. So we've been talking a lot about the feedback that Roger's going to walk us through. And then after we sort of level set and provide that backdrop, we'll talk through some of the more kind of conceptual ideas that the work group is starting to discuss that are going to hopefully shape the compliance framework and that we hope to put out to stakeholders a little later in the summer and early fall. So just that quick caveat, just to hopefully kind of frame up this section a little more. But Roger, thank you for permitting me to jump in, but I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. If we could go to the next slide, please. So some suggestions we saw from stakeholders regarding the penalty options on the firm penalty side. Some suggestions we saw were a phased in penalty firmness and deficiency charges. Additionally, backstop and administrative costs should only fall on deficient participants. On the less firm penalty side, Some things the program should do is explore incentives such as access to pooled resources for compliant entities rather than relying solely on punitive penalties. Focus on creating operational incentives that convert some kind of capacity commitment into real reliability in the program. That the compliance mechanisms are only for binding requirements, and penalties should not be assessed on any informational annual showings. What the focus on non-punitive enforcement. Some of this could be alleviated by bulletin boards, trading mechanisms, and compliance tools before those punitive penalties. What the program is really trying to do is balance those benefits and costs, those carrots and sticks, as to say. Next slide, please. So what should a compliance framework accomplish? The compliance framework should incentivize participants to stay in the program. It should also incent and justify investment in the grid, reward good participant behavior, help achieve the program's goals, and create a mechanism that holds program participants accountable and creating trust in the program and program credibility. Next slide, please. So some tools to achieve the compliance. As mentioned, the program is trying to leverage both carrots and sticks. So one of those tools would be incentives. These could be financial and non-financial. The ability to cure any deficiencies, and then the balance between charges and penalties. With the charge is your ability to buy your way into a benefit in the event of non-compliance versus penalties that are punitive. They could be tiered or progressive penalty structure. Need to consider how the penalty structure could influence market prices, and the program also needs to consider consistency of penalties in other programs. Gravity of penalties is much higher or lower than other programs would definitely drive who may be willing to participate in this program or other programs as well. Next slide, please. So some concepts for initial feedback. Talking about incentives, a capacity or compliance credit. If a participant brings additional capacity to pool, then it's possible credit could be issued or be redeemed against a charge at some point if that entity was non-compliant. Rewarding good behavior for lesser charge or penalties. An example would be if an entity hasn't been subject to a charge or penalty over a certain time frame, and something happens that could result in non-compliance, they could possibly reduce that charge or penalty. Some kind of deficiency charge is another concept that being explored. And to help realize the data element of the value proposition, a penalty could be attached for failure to submit data or submittal of inaccurate data in both the binding and non-binding periods. This would ensure that the program is consistently fed accurate and complete data. Penalties could apply to repeat offenders in the forward showing if they're consistently coming up short, and non-delivery that impacts reliability of the system. Penalty funds that are received could be distributed to compliant entities. Next slide, please.
And I think that was, and maybe we can just go back one more. I think that was the final compliance slide. So are there any questions or thoughts about any of what Roger just sort of walked through from a compliance perspective? Maybe something I will just highlight that Roger mentioned on the previous slide was that the work group is really thinking hard about kind of the suite of options. Maybe suite isn't quite the right word, but all of the different tools that may be available when constructing a compliance framework. So I know that penalties are discussed frequently, but really wanting to make sure that there is a balance of incentives, the ability to cure, charges, and penalties when the design for a compliance framework is being created. So just sort of wanted to really try to hit on that piece because the work group has it is putting a lot of careful thought and consideration in trying to consider all of the different options and taking really a balanced approach in the compliance design. Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'll just ask a couple of questions. One is, if you said this and I missed it, I'm sorry, but did you talk about sort of, I guess, your concepts about when these charges or penalties would attach, you know, whether at year ahead or month ahead? And then my second question is whether, um, I know it was just the last workshop where you talked about the idea of having RSE pooling and a must offer requirement, but has the group considered whether, um, I guess, access to that pooling um, could be an incentive um, for coming sufficient to the forward showing?
Thanks, Megan. I think to answer your first question about the um, timing of the penalties and charges and when those would be assessed, I think those finer details are still being developed within the work group, and those are definitely the next stages of development as we go forward with the compliance framework. On the second question regarding pooled RSCs, I think on the previous slide where where the charges, I think a concept that is currently being explored is that charges concept is if you were compliant, you would be part of that RSC pool, versus if you were non-compliant, paying that charge could essentially still make you part of that pool, but with that charge caveat. Um, does that help in your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think what's maybe different than the premise of my question is as you put it, you can sort of buy your way into that pooling rather than um, it being an access issue, which has some implications either way. But yeah, it answers my question.
And I'll also invite any other members of the work group if they have any thoughts or any additions too, as well as we have this conversation. Bill Goddard, go ahead.
Roger, could you go back to the last slide? I think I'm asking a similar question to Megan. The first bullet, if a participant brings additional capacity to the pool, then a possible credit could be issued to be redeemed against the charge if at some point that entity was non-compliant. Maybe this is topic for a later group, but I'm expecting, since this is a resource adequacy pool, that it would be a lot more than some sort of credit. There'd be some sort of mutual understanding or obligation that if you're long and somebody else is short, you find them somehow? Or is we still going to try to figure out how those two parties find each other? I mean, because part of the thing was well, with pool capacity, maybe we reduce costs because I don't have to build more or get more because somebody already has excess. So this seems awful light on, well, how does the deficient party or somebody even interested, if somebody has extra available RA capacity, how do they meet? Because we aren't a pool. It has to be bilateral, right, for this to happen. Am I too early in this question, or do I get too much into must offers? Or is this coming later?
Thanks, Bill. Um, I think if I understand correctly your question, I think you're right in the way that how your understanding this capacity compliance credit was an idea that the group um, sort of developed as an incentive to the program, and not necessarily. So if what this capacity compliance credit is trying to accomplish is if you yourself were had extra capacity to bring to the pool, and you're compliant, and in some over a certain amount of time, and if at some point you were non-compliant, then because you were bringing a benefit to the pool in previous years, you may receive a credit to be used against your specific charge because in consistent years or in previous years you were consistently meeting the program. This is more of exploring ways to incent the program and to balance that incentive and penalty framework that we're trying to achieve. So this would be if you were compliant for a certain number of years, bringing extra capacity to the pool, bringing a benefit to the pool, and then at some point you were not compliant, and you would then redeem those credits to make yourself compliant. And as mentioned, this is a very early concept that's just being explored, and hasn't really been, the findings haven't actually been worked out yet.
Okay, thanks. Right, that isn't what I thought that meant, but I guess I see what you're getting at now. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'll keep asking questions as they occur to me because there's not, I mean, I get there's not a ton here. Sounds like it's still under discussion, but just if you're seeking feedback on these workshops, then I'm trying to figure out what to be reacting to. And I wonder, I mean, these are all sort of mechanisms, right? Like, I guess I'm understanding the third bullet deficiency charge to just be the kind of normal thing that we're used to, quote unquote penalties, which is the word you use later. But I guess the question is like, have you had conversations about sort of the balance of maybe positive incentives versus charges and penalties that you're trying to strike in the program? And is that balance like similar or different than programs we might have seen before? Are you thinking about, are there ways that you're trying to track in a different direction? Just kind of like big picture. If there's anything you can say there, that might be helpful. Because this is an important issue for states to react to, both from a potential consumer cost perspective when it comes to the level of the charges, but also it really informs the governance conversation when we consider sort of what's at stake.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I think balancing the incentives and the charges and penalties is a core tenet of the working group, trying to explore those financial, non-financial incentives, and to ensure that the penalties are not so high that they prevent participation, but high enough to where it holds participants accountable, is definitely one of the pillars that the compliance work group is definitely keeps in mind when looking at ways to advance this framework. I see John came online. Maybe John has something to add.
Yeah, I did want to kind of to help answer, and I think Roger captured it perfectly there. Um, the working group this is a delicate balance, and this is a difficult piece to the program that we're trying to thread a needle. Um, we want sufficient carrots and sticks, and we don't want it to be just one or just the other. And so trying to figure out, you know, what are the rewards that or the incentives to keep people in the program, but at the same time, we also don't want to create a program that you know kind of has this very relaxed um, kind of laissez-faire. Oh, you didn't make it this time. Okay, well, hopefully we can all you know weather this storm together. And kind of that's where that first bullet point comes in. It was one of the ideas that we threw out there that can we provide a system where if somebody is consistently each year coming with capacity and helping out the program, and then one year something happens out of their control that you know hey, I know we've been doing this for 5 years and we've always been good actors, but we had a problem, and we don't want to create some sort of charge or penalty that is so detrimental to that one-off moment that it scares entities out of the program or puts them in such a financial difficult spot that it takes even more work and more effort to kind of work their way out of. So yes, I think this is fundamentally what we're trying to develop, and what we're trying to create, and to find that perfect balance. And it's been a challenge.
No, thanks. I appreciate the balancing act. I just kind of wanted to hear a sort of a broader sense of like the needle you're trying to thread. I appreciate that, John.
Joe Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Joe Terry from the Idaho PUC, and there was something said in there, and I'm just going to voice my concern and know that you guys probably already have it handled. And I wanted to make sure that whatever we do for this compliance also reflects reality. Like, I understand if you have somebody who's been really, really great and then they're short 1 year, we don't want to like completely kick them in the teeth. But at the same thing, if the entire system is short, there may be nothing there to shore the poor person the poor entity that just came up short, even though it's out of their control. Like, I worry that sometimes we get too eager on compliance and then we forget that we have to mesh that with reality. Like our compliance has to match reality.
Thanks, Joe. That's a very good point with something that we would take back and when we were evaluating this idea of capacity credits of this entity that is short, unfortunately, um, the capacity requirement is still there, and that still affects reliability of the footprint. So that's definitely something that needs to be taken into account when um, going further to developing some of these incentives and penalties.
Yeah. And I think that maybe that's where it turns around, is that those that you could be saying that the guy who provided extra and short of the system might have already been paid for it. But it's a, we have a system to run and it still has to run energy through. And I know you guys are taking this into account. Like, you guys actually really run utilities, and when the power goes out, you're the ones who get the nasty calls. So I know that you guys are looking into this, but I just feel like I had to kind of put my 2 bits on that.
Thanks, Joe. We'll see if any other hands go up, but maybe there are any other questions formulating. I will just try to maybe highlight the fourth bullet, looking at data. And in the last workshop, where the group tried to better articulate the value proposition, really thinking hard about how critical data is and how to incentivize entities providing good and accurate data. So just wanted to make sure that we spent a little time kind of talking about this idea and concept that the work group has been thinking about. And again, this is very conceptual, but considering some sort of penalty potentially attaching to both the binding and the non-binding periods around submission of data. But Megan, you've got your hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, just one final question that is kind of building from the train of thought that Joe just took us down. Uh, has there been discussion in the work group that would be helpful for others to hear about, let's see, how effective different kinds of penalties and incentives might be to encourage people to close the gap? Because I think Joe's appropriately pointing to a situation where you have a really tight system, and incentives and penalties might work differently there than they do when there is some sort of play in the regional system overall, when it isn't as scarce as it is here today. But is there anything more that the work group can offer, high level, about its discussions of how these different mechanisms for, carrots and sticks, as John said, work to motivate the behavior you're trying to see, which is sort of robust long-term forward planning, I guess. Anything more you can say there?
Yeah, I think that's probably the next step, or the step that the work group is going to go towards, is actually looking and exploring the incentives in finer detail, and how, if they eventually are the correct incentives to pursue or to actually develop. I think that's further down the line in this process right now. I think the work group currently is still exploring what is out there, as far as just any creative incentives, so that we can provide more tools to balance those carrots and sticks, see how many carrots we do have out there.
I'd like to add on to what Roger had just said. I think the other thing that the working group is trying to do, one, we're trying to brainstorm, you know, any and all ideas, but I think what's sort of underlying all of this is you're talking about all of these different entities in the West, and everybody sort of has their view on this through their own perspective and what their BAs go through. And you know, I kind of harken back to the presentations that we had in today's um, workshop on the transmission. You know, I presented on what P&M's perspective is, and it was different than what the folks in the Pacific Northwest and what David mentioned from the perspective of NVE. And I think what I'm hoping for, and what I think collectively what we're striving for, is can we create and come up with some concepts and some ideas here that are not filtered through each one of our BAs and what compliance means to us, and can we collectively as a group come up with some ideas that are going to affect the entire footprint. And this goes back to the challenge that I, you know, mentioned earlier is, you know, we want to thread that needle of, you know, enough incentives and enough deficiencies to kind of keep everybody moving forward in the same direction, but not create a system that is could potentially be so devastating that some entities would look at this program, a voluntary program, and go, there's just too much risk. The reward's good, but there's just too much risk. So again, I sort of feel like I'm giving you this non-answer of we don't know what it is. We kind of know what we're looking for and where we'd like to get to. It's just that challenge, and collectively, can we create something that everybody can live with? And that's what I'm hoping that we achieve.
Thanks, John. And to the degree that you get to the place where you can put some of those um, options, trade-offs, disagreements, things like that out in these workshops, gives a little bit more for people to hang on to and maybe react to and help you think through, as opposed to putting out only what you've completely agreed to in the work group. Guess that's just a personal perspective, but um, you know, uh, it calls some questions a little bit for feedback if you can do that.
That's really good feedback. Yes, thank you.
I'm not seeing any additional hands, so maybe we'll do a last call if anyone has additional questions or thoughts on compliance. All right. I think we can go ahead and move to the next slide. Thank you, Roger. Appreciate you walking us through this. So we will start our wrap up. We have our two timeline slides, no changes since these were initially presented. Again, still tracking to putting out a draft of an initial proposal in November. We would have a workshop to just kind of walk through what's in that draft of an initial proposal, and there would be an open comment period. And I'm sorry, that would be mid-November, and then have an open comment period through the end of the year. Go to the next slide. For 2027, in January, reviewing those comments, incorporating those into a revised initial draft proposal, looking to present that to the row board sometime in late March. We can go to the next slide. Over the next couple months, which is what in the near term we have ahead of us, this was our last workshop for July. We have a comment period that will be open through August 6th. Any written feedback that folks could provide would be very much appreciated and very useful to help inform conversations as they continue to move forward. Noting that the comment periods don't perfectly align with the workshops, so we may not be able to incorporate all of the feedback into subsequent workshops, but we're trying to do our best to provide as many sort of written comment periods as possible. And just because for instance, the July written comment period closes on the 6th, if there are thoughts that crop up, please don't hesitate to include them in future comments. So this isn't closing the door by any means on providing comments, but we're just trying to do our best to sort of structure them in the most meaningful sort of time blocks as possible for both stakeholders and then for the work group to be able to digest them. So quickly taking a look at August, we have 2 workshops scheduled. The first one is on August 11th. That will be a discussion about technical design. Just want to highlight, we put out an email earlier this week to stakeholders. There has been some interest from stakeholders in potentially providing some material and a presentation at the technical workshop. If there is anyone who has thoughts or would be interested in doing this as it relates to resource accreditation, we would very much welcome folks taking the opportunity to present just kind of additional thoughts or considerations or a perspective that they feel would be helpful to keep in mind as that portion of the design moves forward. So we've had at least one group reach out, and if anyone else has interest in doing that, please let us know when we put the email out earlier in the week, proposing the deadline for notification of tomorrow. We could probably extend that a little bit, but just sort of for our planning purposes, if folks could let us know sooner rather than later, and as much as possible respect the deadline of tomorrow, that would be appreciated. But please reach out if there is interest from a stakeholder perspective on presenting at the technical workshop on resource accreditation. Then the second workshop in late August, we'll be talking more about transmission and governance, and hope at that point in time to be able to present more specifics on kind of the thinking of what revised and further fleshed out transmission framework might look like. And same thing on governance. Again, a comment period 2 weeks after that last August workshop, looking for comments on those August workshops at that point. Then in September, we have 2 additional workshops scheduled. Another one on September 10th, talking more about technical design. Workshop number 13 is a bit of a catch-all at this point. Hoping at that workshop to really present as much information as possible on all of the different topics, the major topics at least, that will be in the initial draft proposal. And again, that final comment period, comments due on October 1st. So that again is what the rest of the summer and the early fall looks like from a workshop perspective. And we can go to the next slide. Then again, just a reminder where to find materials. Everything is posted on the web page. We have all of the workshop dates, the links to all of these meetings, the slides, different documentation that we put out. So that's your one-stop shop. And if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. The email is listed on the right side, resourceadequacy@rowesternenergy.org. And we can go to the final slide, which I believe is just a last call for any questions or thoughts that folks haven't had an opportunity to raise that they would like to before we close. I'm not seeing any hands. But maybe just one more note on comments. So a lot of the July workshops, the content there was more educational in nature. So understanding that not a lot of additional details were provided, but as much as possible, any written feedback at this point about what has been discussed would be very helpful. We do recognize that it's probably going to be more directional in nature. So kind of understand that maybe tension, but uh, really in anything at this point is helpful, but we do recognize that I think Megan sort of where a lot of your comments were coming from, that without a lot of additional specificity, stakeholders may have a harder time providing a lot of feedback. But again, anything that's on anyone's minds would be very much appreciated and helpful for the work group. So I'm trying to give one more pause, but I don't see any hands raised. So I think we will conclude here. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the engagement, the questions. We hope to see comments in early August and look forward to talking again on August 11th with everyone at the next workshop. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.